I gotta say that telephoto lenses are one of my most favorite kinds of lenses out there. They've given me perspectives I wouldn't normally be able to get unless I was to somehow get close to certain subjects. Something that's not always possible, like in this situation where I saw this snake. What kind of snake is this? I have no idea, but with the Sigma 150-600, I was able to at least get a shot of it since I wasn't trying to mess around and find out. I've been doing my research on this lens and have been really wondering some things like how good it is in the quality department, if it was practical to predominantly handhold, and of course a few other things. Given the fact that my curiosity tends to become very strong, I did what most people might do, which is to say I rented this lens. In this review of the Sigma 150-600, I'm going to take a look at the specs of this lens, take a look at some of the images I was able to take with this lens, and talk about my overall experience with it. Before we do get started, I just want to give you a fair warning that this is not going to be a super technical review. There are a plethora of other videos out there that go over things like sharpness, bokeh, and other things like that, so I'd rather stick to my personal experiences with this lens. With that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the design aspects of the Sigma 150-600. The first thing I do think that anybody is sure to notice about this lens is its weight. Before I rented this lens, I had been using the Tamron 70-300, and I almost wasn't ready for the weight difference here. Sigma states that this lens weighs 74.1 ounces, which is about 4.63 pounds. In the grand scheme of things, this doesn't sound like much, but since this lens is as big as it actually is, it surely can be heavy at times. This lens is available either in Sony E mount, which is what we have here, and for the L mount systems like Leica, Blackmagic, and Panasonic and Sigma cameras. Sigma does state that this lens is splash and dust resistant, but the only thing I see here is this slim rubber material and not an actual gasket, so I would take that info with a huge grain of salt. The build of materials here is basically top-notch. Sigma uses a combination of an aluminum frame coupled with their thermally stable composite construction process, and damn, does it feel like you got something extremely solid for what you pay for. The buttons on this lens are made of a high quality plastic, with the exception of the 3 custom buttons near the middle, which are made of rubber. The feedback response you get from all of the buttons is really good and will ensure that you know you either press them or switch them on. The focus and zoom rings are also made of a high quality rubber with sturdy ridges for precise rotations. This lens does feature a tripod mount, and like I've been saying, it feels solid and is made of some kind of metal just like the rest of this lens. Something I absolutely like about this tripod mount is that it does have hard stops for when you want to move the lens and leave it in vertical positions when taking a photo. The one thing that may bother some is the fact that it isn't fully removable. You can remove the Arca Swiss foot at the bottom, but that will still leave you with this protruding connector here. Though you can't remove this part, I will say that I'm extremely glad that Sigma does allow you to attach a standard 1x4 screw here. This will allow you to take a bit of the weight off of the lens, while also allowing you to attach your own foot or something else to this lens. In my case, I attached my PGY quick release system here for easy mounting to my tripod. Oh, and by the way, if you did want to go about removing it, it'll take a 2.5-inch thick Allen key to do so. The lens hood is made of a very high quality feeling plastic with a metal fastening screw at the top of it. Out of any lens hood I've used, this has to be my favorite one, as there's no railing system to align it to, no pedal shape to potentially allow light to enter from a specific side. It's just a solid circle with a fair amount of depth that will make sure it does what it's supposed to do. The filter thread size for this lens is 95 millimeters, which can equate to expensive filters since they're not so common, and it's also slightly comical how big these filters are. The minimum focus distance is 0.58 meters on the short end and 2.8 meters on the long end. Converted to feet, that comes out to about 1.9 feet on the shorter end and 9.19 feet on the longer end. This is a variable aperture lens with the fastest value at the widest end being f5 and the slowest value being f6.3 at the longest end. If you're wondering when those values start to change, then from 150 to 173 millimeters, the aperture stays at f5. After that, it starts to change from 174 to 365 millimeters to f5.6, and then from 366 to 600 millimeters, the longest f-stop you'll get is f6.3. The longest f-stop number achievable is f29 on this lens. As far as convenience features, this lens comes with an AF/MF toggle, a focus limiter switch, which definitely comes in handy when you're at the longest end of the range, optical stabilization, which has 2 modes, a custom switch that also has 2 modes and will function differently depending on which system you get this for, and the last switch you get is an LTS switch, which stands for lock, tight, and smooth. The autofocus performance with this lens is pretty good, especially on the shorter end of things. On the longer 600 millimeter end, I did find that I had trouble focusing on my target sometimes, which resulted in the lens hunting for focus and either eventually getting it right or giving up on rare occasions. What really did help me in these moments is the focus limiter switch, since it made things a bit easier when using this lens at the 600 millimeter end. The tracking performance of this lens is also pretty good. I was able to track and follow subjects accurately, although there were the occasions where the subject was lost or the reticle would move to another part of the subject, resulting in me having to kind of do the tracking all over again. Nonetheless, it was more consistent than it was inconsistent, I guess I could say. Like I mentioned before, I've been using the Tamron 70-300, which is a great beginner telephoto lens for sure. The only things that really did bother me about it is the fact that there seemed to be a lack of contrast on my copy of it, and there was no stabilization built in. I have to say I was really surprised by the stabilization on the Sigma 150-600. There are 2 different modes like I mentioned before, and you can use it in mode 1, which is more for framing, while mode 2 is for panning, which is perfect for capturing subjects like birds in the sky or cars. I found myself using mode 1 the majority of the time for relatively still subjects, and I can say confidently that the stabilization in this mode was more than adequate for what I was trying to do. There are even times where I was able to shoot under the length plus shutter rule and came away with pictures I was more than satisfied with. I did try out mode 2, which again is for panning. I found that this mode also worked pretty darn well, making it so that I could get clear shots even with my drastic novice panning movements. The custom modes also helped out a ton when it came to the 2 different modes of stabilization. I found that the C1 setting did help a lot with the level 1 stabilization, making what I saw in the viewfinder much less shaky than without using that C1 customization setting. The C2 setting is something I noticed a bit less, but I can say did definitely help out when using it with the level 2 stabilization. The only way I'm able to actually make this kind of claim is due to the fact that the pictures I took when using this combination came out with a surprisingly good quality for how fast I was panning. You can see an example of this quality here with this truck I took a picture of, and I'm even able to make out the make and model of the other car in this picture, even though it wasn't my target. When it comes to the field of view, I can probably spend time giving you the numbers in degrees, but I thought of something that might be a bit better, since I definitely cannot be the only one out there trying to figure out whether this lens is worth it. I decided to set up this test here where I zoomed as far as I can to see whether I could see this depot or station at the top of this mountain. This mountain being Pikes Peak, by the way. For more context, what I'll be doing is taking a look at the 300 millimeter length, 400 millimeters, 500 millimeters, and 600 millimeters so that you can see the clear differences between other telephoto lenses in the range that you would potentially purchase. So right now, as I've been talking, we've been at the 150 millimeter length. So let's go ahead and move over to 300 millimeters. Now, as you can see here, I'm able to make out the depot, but I'm still not as close to it. If we go ahead and move over to 400 millimeters, you'll see that you can make it out a bit more, but we're still pretty far. If we move over to 500 millimeters, you'll see that I still can't make it out, and that atmospheric distortion starts to play an even bigger role right now. Finally, at 600 millimeters, there isn't much of a difference. However, I did start to think of something where 600 millimeters may still end up being useful, and that is with APS-C mode or an APS-C camera in general. So when using an actual APS-C camera or a full frame camera in APS-C mode, you're going to get a bit more length out of a lens like this, even though the resolution of your final picture is going to be lower. Let's go ahead and take a look at what you get with Sony's APS-C equivalent mode. Right now, I'm at the widest end of the lens, which is equivalent to 225 millimeters. If we move on, here's what you'll get at 450 millimeters. Now we're going to go ahead and take a look at 600 millimeters. And then here's 750 millimeters. Lastly, we have 900 millimeters. You can see that in these examples that you do get a decent amount of range. However, it's not going to be something that you can use for everything. And this is a point I will be talking about later. Now that we've pretty much gone through all of the crucial stuff, at least hopefully I got through all of that, let's go ahead and take a look at some sample pictures. But before I do that, I do want to give a shout out to the people that made this review possible, and that is lensrentals.com. This video isn't sponsored by them, but they did make it possible for me to try out these lenses and share my experiences with you. Lensrentals.com is as straightforward as it sounds. You can pretty much rent any kind of camera equipment on the market, even drones, which is another one of my favorite kinds of cameras. Another cool thing is that they have their Keeper program, which allows you to purchase almost any equipment you've rented. They'll even take 7 days of the rental fees off of the final buyout price. If that's not enough, they even have a rewards program that allows you to gain points off of your current rental and use those points towards your next one. Overall, using lensrentals.com is a great way to check out that equipment you had your eye on for a while but really wanted to get some hands-on time with before you make your final decision. If you're interested in taking that lens you've been looking at for a spin, head over to lensrentals.com and use the discount code W.I.H 15 to get 15% off your first order. Now let's go ahead and move on to those samples I was talking about. those samples have given you some idea of just what you can do or what you can capture with this lens. Anyway, what I wanted to do for the end of this review is talk about my experience, or rather the most prominent parts of my experience using this lens. So these tips or insights are really going to be, I guess, more useful for people who are at the same stage I'm at, kind of novice to intermediate. For professional photographers, you know, if you are out there and you have some tips for what I can do better with holding the lens or just what I'm about to say, yeah, go ahead and put those out there in a respectful way, and we'll take a look at that. But anyway, let's go ahead and talk about some insights with this. So I think the first thing I want to talk about is carrying this lens when you are not using it. Obviously, this is a huge lens. It's not the biggest out there that is in the Sony E mount family or system. However, it's a big lens. Now, you do get a carrying case with it that Sigma will give you. However, I am not privy to how that carrying case does. Other than that too, I just kind of wouldn't want to use a carrying case. Like when I'm outside and I know I'm going to shoot with this, I want some way to carry it. So what I would definitely and heavily recommend is getting yourself a strap like this, the Peak Design Slide, or maybe even the Peak Design Slide Light. I wouldn't go with anything that's kind of narrow, with something wide like this to distribute that weight across your body. I've found huge success with carrying this, you know, when I'm outside and just having the lens just kind of right here, like a little baby carrier or something like that. I've even found it easier to carry the lens behind me like this. It just hangs there and everything like that. I'm not saying it has to be any of the Peak Design products or anything, but something that is sturdy. I do tend to trust Peak Design products a little more just because the anchors here have been stated to be able to hold 200 pounds, I think, or 200 kg. I don't know what that is in pounds. I'll put it up on the screen somewhere. If it's 200 pounds, it's correct then. But yeah, I look at these straps all of the time to see if they're fraying or anything along those lines. And I'm always doing tests, just pulling on these. Either way, what I'm getting at though is just find a way to hold it, you know, when you're not using it, because the other thing is you're going to want this at the ready. You know, if you see a bird, it's just so easy to be able to do this, or if you see something you want to take a picture of, you don't have to pull it out of the bag. You don't have to like do anything else. Just lift and shoot, or come from the side and shoot. The next prominent part of my experience also has to do with the weight. And this is something, I mean, it's not that I didn't know that it was going to be a thing, but it could potentially become a thing for people who are not used to the weight of something like this. And I'm not used to it all the way either. Let me not act like I'm here, you know, not struggling sometimes. But essentially, when you are panning up and down with this lens, it can become heavy. Now, I typically have the tripod mount of the lens just sort of upside down like this, but I have recently started just kind of like putting it back to the center and just using it as a mount point. However, here's the thing. From an ergonomic standpoint, like I said during this review, I tend to like zooming in with the barrel. The focus ring here, I just find like there's too many turns. Like you have to kind of remember every single time. I mean, I guess that was just pretty easy, but sometimes like if you don't place your finger in the right place, then you'll end up having to do many turns. Now, since I typically end up using the lens like this, you know, the thing is that my left hand, I never anticipated how much stress would be on it, you know, going up and down and things of that sort. You know, panning left and right is okay because then I can just kind of use my elbow pressed against my chest here and stabilize things, so I don't have a problem with that. It's pretty much when I have to lift up and down and take my elbow away from my chest or like that, and I need it to be free, which is where, you know, the weight of this kind of becomes, I don't want to say significant, but it becomes noticeable, I guess. So you're definitely going to want to get used to the weight of this lens. If you are doing a lot of, you know, up and down shooting along those lines, you could also, I guess, kind of go for the tripod at that point. But the problem with this is that, you know, if you need to zoom back or anything like that, now you're still having to adjust your hand, going back and forth, and it's just, you know, something to get used to. I suppose one thing you could also try is treating the lens like a dumbbell and just kind of doing some reps with it to get used to the weight also. All right, so the next point about using this lens is going to be, it's kind of a contradiction to what I've been saying or what I've been talking about. Like I said, for like the millionth time, I like zooming in like this. I feel like it's much quicker, just much easier, much less effort. However, one of the potential issues someone might have when zooming in and out this way and everything is pretty cool until you need to manipulate these buttons over here. Now, luckily, the thing about these buttons is they're pretty easy to get used to. You know, if you're going from here to here, you now have to basically move your hands back and forth. And like, let's say, for instance, if I'm doing this and I want to do the auto focus slash manual focus toggle, which is already a manual focus, didn't know that. So I can easily do that, but then I'm going back here. If I wanted to do like the focus limiter switch or something like that, I know that's down here, but then I still have to go back and forth. Like, for instance, if I'm out here or something like that and I want to mess with the stabilization level or something like that, I know that that's here, and I usually start from the bottom when I know, and then I can do that. But either way, it's just going back and forth between these very quickly, especially like you just saw my strap got in the way. It's just having to gain the muscle memory of, I guess, realizing what switches where and zooming in and out if you're not doing it with the focus ring. When you're doing it with the focus ring, it's a little bit easier because at least your hand is in the mid-range of the lens, so you know you can do that. But yet again, another insight that I wanted to give. Next thing here would be, sorry about that, I've seen mountain lions where I am and bears and other stuff, so just want to be careful. But the next thing here would be that the stabilization on this thing, I cannot say it enough. If I didn't say it enough, I'm saying it now. The stabilization on this lens is awesome. You know, like I said before, I was using the Tamron 70-300. There were a lot of issues I had with that lens. Especially the other thing is that there was no locking mechanism. Yeah, the stabilization on this thing is just, to me, it's amazing. I know that there are going to be some people, some snob photographers out there, you know, non-stop photographers out there that are going to say that the stabilization on this is like subpar, mediocre, whatever. I wouldn't listen to anybody else, and I'm not saying I'm an authority either, but the stabilization on this thing does make such a difference. So, you know, if someone's telling you that the stabilization on this thing is bad, I would say try it out for yourself. Then again, I'm also the type that just kind of doesn't listen to anybody else. I like to do things and try them for my own, but that's just me. So the last part of my experience with this lens, you know, I think is something that's really important to understand. And this is something I went over when I was talking about the field of view and showing you all the examples, but I'm going to go back to that example and kind of talk about something that people may not think about. And that is when 600 millimeters is not enough for what you want to capture. So let's go ahead and take a look at some videos and pictures to kind of dictate that. In order to make this point, I'm going to go back to the field of view example I provided before. And yes, I know this is probably going to come off like a contradiction, but my aim is to give all of the information I can to basically help, so I'm fine with that. So for someone like myself who has never used a 600 millimeter before, I wasn't really sure what to expect, but I knew it would at least be double what I was using before. I wanted to come back to this example because I thought it would set some expectations for how far you will be able to get realistically. So remember before that the longest length I was actually able to get out of this lens was 900 millimeters. This was only using APS-C mode, and I still couldn't make out the depot clearly at the top of the mountain, and this is atmospheric distortion aside. Another situation where the limits of the 600 millimeter length came into play is when I was trying to capture these black and blue birds. They kept flying in and out of a particular set of trees that were literally about a 5-second walk in front of me. I wanted to get much closer, but they were pretty skittish, and rightfully so. I did end up using the APS-C mode to extend the length a little bit more, but I still couldn't get as close as I wanted, and due to the fact that these birds were so fast, I couldn't take the picture in a way that I wanted to either, as you can see here by it being underexposed, which is definitely my fault for sure. Now, I do have some other examples of this, but ultimately what I'm talking about is the fact that even though this is one of the only two choices for maximum focal length in Sony's lineup, it may still leave you wanting to look into the Sony 200-600 with the teleconverter attachments offered. In that same example I just talked about with the birds going in and out of the tree, if I was able to use something like the Sony 200-600 with a teleconverter, I could stand farther away from that tree without them really being worried about my presence. Of course, that kind of setup is not without its issues either. First of all, I believe that you lose about 1 stop of light when using the 1.4x teleconverter, while you'll lose 2 stops of light with the 2x converter. This might not be too much of an issue when using a full frame sensor, but could be when using an APS-C sensor. There's also the fact that I've been seeing that this lens can be hit or miss in image quality due to some unchecked quality issues with some copies. Something you'd really want to check for, especially if you intend to add the teleconverters, since that would just kind of magnify those defects anyway. There's also the fact that the cost of this lens and teleconverter set will basically convert your bank account to zero if you don't have it like that. Either way though, the Sigma 150-600 is still a prime choice, even if it's possible you may not have enough reach from time to time. The good news is that I rented this lens twice and both copies seem consistent with the quality of their image. I do wish that Sony would stop stonewalling all the third-party companies out there for making teleconverters for the emount system. I mean, I understand why, but they already limit third-party lenses in regards to how many frames they can capture anyway, so why impose another limitation? Anyway, I think that all of these points are pretty much what stuck out to me about my experience with this lens, but overall, I'll say it again. The Sigma 150-600 is definitely a lens you should look into if you're trying to get the most zoom range, but don't want to go through the whole range of your wallet to do so. Long-range zoom lenses typically cost a lot, but I found that the price of this one is reasonable for what you get with this overall package. I ended up liking this lens so much that I'll definitely be picking up a copy of my own when life allows. Of course, if you'd like to help life allow it faster for me, then you can do so by purchasing a copy of this lens or the other equipment I used to create this video from one of my affiliate links down below. But, as always, like I always say, of course, if you can find any of these items cheaper than what you see in my affiliate links, then I would always recommend going with that, because who doesn't like to get something not for full price, right? Anyway, I do hope that this review was helpful, and if it was, consider leaving a comment on what was most helpful to you. Of course, if there are any things I didn't go over here that you would like to know, you can always leave a question that I'll surely get back to. With all that being said though, wherever you are in the world, have a great day, a great afternoon, a great evening, or a great night, and I will see you in the next video.